So we were wondering if you could just start off by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So my name's Keme Nzerem and I am a journalist. As well as being a journalist, I'm a filmmaker and I also run a media training business. So I help people get good at doing interviews for the media.
As a journalist, how do you ensure that you are not ingraining a biased perspective in your reporting, and do you feel that sometimes a certain bias is necessary?
There are lots of journalists who will tell you that they are 100% objective, that there can be such a thing as a lack of bias or objectivity, but that's just not true. Everybody has some form of bias, everybody has some form of prejudice. It is the way the human mind works, and it is the way that storytelling works. You can't really understand the world in isolation of what you already know, so it builds in bias. And it's the job of every journalist or objective storyteller, and we need to separate out novelists and essayists from that. It's the job of every journalist to at least try and acknowledge their bias and understand what our own thought process is, to try therefore to minimize the impact of that bias, because certainly in the UK and in a lot of Europe, journalism is regulated to some degree, and broadcast journalism is even more regulated. If you're going to work for a conventional news organisation, you have to take both sides into account. And there's a good reason for that. We want to trust what we're hearing, and we want to make sure that if somebody says something, that the other side or the other sides, because stories don't always just have a one and the other side, that as many relevant viewpoints are taken into account as possible. So the most important thing for somebody like me working in a kind of conventional news environment is to acknowledge my own biases, which do exist, and secondly, to make sure that if somebody says something that you really think through, well, hang on a minute, they've made this allegation against or about this other person. It's not for me to necessarily, I might have a view as to whether what they're saying is correct or incorrect, but I have to go to that other person and say, person X has just said this, what's your view? So there is a process that we go through, and that is about being balanced. Now, is bias necessary? Well, actually, one of the things that we've seen over the last few years, an explosion in unregulated media, a lot of which is pretty right-wing, and I'm not arguing that bias is necessary, but it is important to understand what else is out there and to counter what you might consider to be, or what I would certainly consider to be, damaging narratives. On top of that, generally, power, as I'm sure you know, goes alongside resources, and it costs quite a lot of money to run a newspaper or a media house. So a lot of media is either right-leaning or far to the right. So it's really, really important as a journalist to kind of situate yourself in that political reality and try and make sure that you are giving voices to the people that don't have a voice. And that's a large part of my work, is telling stories that don't get told.
So building on that, would you say that a journalist is less of an intermediary of the story, but kind of has an impact on how the story is viewed by the people consuming it?
Whether a journalist or a news organisation sees it or not, they are not just intermediaries. And it is really important that we try to be transparent brokers, that we try to sit in the middle and make sure everybody involved in a story has an equal opportunity to put their view forward. As I said, in the context of understanding that, if the general noise, if the story that everybody else is hearing is regressive, if you take some countries that don't have a free media, take Russia for example, for us in the rest of the world, we can look at what's happening inside Russia and think, well, I'd really want to make sure that I put the other side of the story. But of course, the reality is, if you're working in a repressive area, you risk being silenced and not just being told to shut up, but worse, made to shut up.
Yeah.
So there are risks involved in being a journalist as well. Luckily, not so much in Switzerland, and not so much in the UK. But often freedom registers, of which many exist, will throw up surprising results. There's some places you are less free to be that honest, transparent broker than you might think you are as a journalist.
Building on this theme of bias, regarding social media, information is more widespread and reaches every audience more quickly than ever. What sort of an impact would you say this has had on journalism, and what are the positives and negatives?
So I'm going to say something that's mildly controversial. Social media for lots of journalists is incredibly useful because it allows you to connect directly with the readers, and more than that, it allows you to get information really, really easily. So again, going back to the example of what's been happening in Ukraine and Russia, the social media has allowed voice freedom and voices of democracy to some extent be heard and proliferate, which is a really, really important thing for a free media. But there's another way of looking at this. 20 years ago, when I started as a journalist, there was a very, very straightforward production process. Certainly in television, you'd have a certain number of bulletins a day, and you would produce your material for those bulletins, and your kind of work life was relatively boundaried. What's happened with social media is it has collapsed those boundaries, and you're always on. People are always talking to you, you are always talking to them. There is a huge demand to produce material quickly and get it out there immediately. And that has an impact on mental health of the journalists who are doing that work, because it becomes much harder to switch off. So there are, in terms of democracy and the role of the media, generally social media has the capacity to be good, but it also amplifies and proliferates people like Andrew Tate, okay? And there are positives because it allows journalists to connect with the world in a unfiltered way, but it also, I think, has some damaging impacts on the well-being of journalists. It's really quite a big deal never being able to switch off.
According to statistics on the Channel 4 website, Channel 4 reaches more 16 to 34-year-olds than any other commercial broadcaster across streaming and TV. Does this have any impact on the way things are broadcasted, and if so, what is it?
One of the really evident things that all media houses are grappling with is viewing figures generally are dropping off a cliff for young people, and there's a good reason for that. Your generation consumes media in a very different way to my generation. In my day, back when Triceratops were roaming the earth and the rest of it, you'd turn on TV and you'd watch your news at a certain time. But that's like so yesterday, man. And obviously, so your generation want your stuff now. So different media houses are chasing ways to engage people like you with their content, and they're competing with YouTubers and TikTokers, some of whom are very damaging and dangerous, like Andrew Tate, and some of them are really progressive. I look at the content that my daughters consume, and I'm amazed at how your generation is totally schooling my generation on things like trans rights and the rest of it. Is a very, very different world, which is brilliant. So how do slightly boring, staid content producers news, which comparatively it's not as interesting, right? As really, really kind of sticky, whatever youth culture stuff you might want to call it. And the producers that are doing well are understanding how to use TikTok and are packaging and formatting the content in a way that works for an audience that wants product delivered to them in a different way. Now, is it affecting what we see on the TV news bulletin? There's definitely some kind of cross-fertilization, but the standard format of here's a big story, let's obviously make it as interesting as we can, followed by, the forensic grilling of a decision maker in the form of an interview, that hasn't really changed.
Turning a bit on to a different axis, can you tell us a little bit about the organisation you co-founded, Opening Up the Outdoors, and why there is such a lack of inclusivity in the outdoors?
It's something that I'm sure lots of you guys, because you live in Geneva, you live, next to an amazing lake and, not many miles from both the Jura and the Alps. Lots of people who live here are connected to the outdoors in a way that lots of people in the UK and in British cities are not. Now, it just so happens that I was introduced to, I lived in the countryside when I was young, and I was introduced to skiing and mountain biking and outdoor stuff when I was pretty little. And it's always been my happy place. It's where I go to feel connected with nature, and also, I have quite a hyperactive mind, and I find that it's very hard to silence the thoughts. Not that I'm completely unhinged. And one of the ways that I manage that is just either connecting with nature or doing scary stuff, right? So cycling too fast or skiing too fast. But I've noticed for as long as I can remember, there are very few people of colour, relatively, and there are lots of reasons for that, and it's probably too long to go into why that is. There are very few people of colour who ski, and frankly, for a long time, because I was doing quite a lot of diversity work in my work, it's not something I confronted. Anyway, towards the end of the BLM protests, because I'm quite connected with a lot of the outdoor industry, I know a lot of people there, I do quite a lot of work with the outdoor industry, I was asked to help facilitate discussions between some really big outdoor brands and some outdoor organisers to find ways to support grassroots groups who were encouraging more people of colour into the outdoors. And Opening Up the Outdoors is the outcome of that coming together. And what we are doing, we set up a kind of mini business skills course for outdoor change makers. Because oftentimes people that set up, let's say, so the people that we ended up supporting, we were supporting a black women surfing group, black climbers group, a Muslim hiking organisation, very interesting range of organisations. They're often set up by people in their spare time, like a side bet, alongside their regular job and career. And actually building a viable business is quite hard. Nobody is born with business skills. So in setting up and funding a business skills course for these change makers, we are helping them to shift the dial on who it is that gets to participate in the outdoors and breaking down those doors. So it has been and is still a really exciting piece of work for us.
So in terms of more on a small scale, for example, like in a school and for young people, how do you think that young people can have an impact on this and increase inclusivity on outdoor activities?
I think the first thing, and this is likely to be something that your generation, because we know you are generally more open to discussion and new ideas than old people like me, I think it is understanding what we might call the intersectionality of barriers to participation. So the kind of conventional conception, let's take skiing or climbing, is that it's something that you endure, it's something that's really hard, it's something that you kind of battle through, it's about conquest. So it appeals to a fairly kind of gnarly, athletic type, right? And not everybody is interested in that. And if you start to layer different identities on top of that, let's just say, for example, you are a elder Muslim woman who veils, and you don't have an athletic, a conventionally athletic body shape, but you kind of look up at a hill and think, you know, I'd really like to try hiking, because who wouldn't? Because hiking is amazing, right? Although for your generation it might be a bit boring, I don't know. To go into that space where you don't see people like you, where you might feel that people look at your veil and would give you funny looks, where you might think that people will look at your body shape and think, what's that person doing here? They should, you know, they whatever. Understanding intersectionality and why some people might recoil from exposing themselves to this, you know, very, very public activity is the first thing. It's to not judge, it's to welcome, and it's to make sure that everybody has an equal right to participate in something that is not just good for our physical health, it's good for our mental health as well. You know, the hills are alive with the sound of music. That resonates with people on many, many different levels. So I think for your generation, the first thing is to understand that different people do engage differently, and if you've not grown up with it, it can feel very, very alien and very, very scary.
I think that's it. Yeah, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your great questions.